David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 8. My Holidays, Especially One Happy Afternoon. When we arrived before the inn where the mail stopped, I was shown up to a nice little bedroom with dolphin painted on the door. Very cold I was, I know, notwithstanding the hot tea they had given me before a large fire downstairs, and very glad I was to turn into the dolphin's bed, pull the dolphin's blankets round my head, and go to sleep. Mr. Barkis, the carrier, was to call for me in the morning at 9 o'clock. I got up at 8, a little giddy from the shortness of my night's rest, and was ready for him before the appointed time. He received me exactly as if not 5 minutes had elapsed since we were last together, and I had only been into the hotel to get change for sixpence or something of that sort. As soon as I and my box were in the cart and the carrier was seated, the lazy horse walked away with us, all at his accustomed pace. "You look very well, Mr. Barkis," I said, thinking he would like to know it. Mr. Barkis rubbed his cheek with his cuff, and then looked at his cuff as if he expected to find some bloom upon it, but made no other acknowledgment of the compliment. "I gave your message, Mr. Barkis," I said. "I wrote to Peggotty." "Ah," said Mr. Barkis. Mr. Barkis seemed gruff and answered dryly. "Wasn't it right, Mr. Barkis?" I asked after a little hesitation. "Why, no," said Mr. Barkis. "Not the message." "The message was right enough," said Mr. Barkis. "But it come to an end there." Not understanding what he meant, I repeated inquisitively, "Came to an end, Mr. Barkis?" "Nothing come of it," he explained, looking at me sideways. "No answer." There was an answer expected, was there, Mr. Barkis?" said I, opening my eyes, for this was a new light to me. "When a man says he's willing," said Mr. Barkis, turning his glance slowly on me again, "it is much to say that man's a-waiting for a answer." "Well, Mr. Barkis?" "Well," said Mr. Barkis, carrying his eyes back to his horse's ears, "that man's been a-waiting for a answer ever since." "Have you told her so, Mr. Barkis?" "No," growled Barkis, reflecting on it. "I ain't got no call to go and tell her so. I never said 6 words to her myself. I ain't a-going to tell her so." "Would you like me to do it, Mr. Barkis?" I said doubtfully. "You might tell her if you would," said Mr. Barkis with another slow look at me, "that Mr. Barkis was a-waiting for an answer. Says you. What name is it?" "Her name?" "Ah," said Mr. Barkis with a nod of his head. "Peggotty." "Christian name or natural name?" said Mr. Barkis. "Oh, it's not her Christian name. Her Christian name is Clara." "Is it, though?" said Mr. Barkis. He seemed to find an immense fund of reflection in this circumstance, and sat pondering and inwardly whistling for some time. "Well," he resumed at length, "says you, Peggotty, Barkis is a-waiting for a answer. Says she, perhaps, answer to what? Says you, to what I told you. What is that? She says, Barkis is willing, says you." This extremely artful suggestion Mr. Barkis accompanied with a nudge of his elbow that gave me quite a stitch in my side. After that, he slouched over his horse in his usual manner and made no other reference to the subject except, half an hour afterwards, taking a piece of chalk from his pocket and writing up inside the tilt of the cart, "Clara Peggotty," apparently as a private memorandum. God knows how infantine the memory may have been that was awakened within me by the sound of my mother's voice in the old parlor, when I set foot in the hall. She was singing in a low tone. I think I must have lain in her arms and heard her singing so to me when I was but a baby. I believed from the solitary and thoughtful way in which my mother murmured her song that she was alone, and I went softly into the room. She was sitting by the fire, suckling an infant whose tiny hand she held against her neck. I spoke to her, and she started and cried out, but seeing me, she called me her dear Davy, her own boy, and coming half across the room to meet me, kneeled down upon the ground and kissed me, and laid my head down upon her bosom near the little creature that was nestling there, to put its hand up to my lips. I wish I had died. I wish I had died then with that feeling in my heart. I should have been more fit for heaven than I have ever been since. He is your brother, said my mother, fondling me. Davy, my pretty boy, my poor child. Then she kissed me more and more and clasped me round the neck. This she was doing when Peggotty came running in and bounced down on the ground beside us and went mad about us both for a quarter of an hour. It seemed that Mr. and Mrs. Murdstone had gone out upon a visit in the neighbourhood and would not return before night. I had never hoped for this. I had never thought it possible that we three could be together undisturbed once more, and I felt for the time as if the old days were come back. We dined together by the fireside. Peggotty was in attendance to wait upon us, but my mother wouldn't let her do it, and made her dine with us. While we were at table, I thought it a favourable occasion to tell Peggotty about Mr. Barkis, who, before I had finished what I had to tell her, began to laugh and throw her apron over her face. Peggotty, said my mother, what's the matter? Peggotty only laughed the more and held her apron right over her face when my mother tried to pull it away, and sat as if her head were in a bag. What are you doing, you stupid creature? Said my mother, laughing. Oh, drat the man, cried Peggotty. He wants to marry me. It would be a very good match for you, wouldn't it? Said my mother. Oh, I don't know, said Peggotty. Don't ask me. I wouldn't have him if he was made of gold, nor I wouldn't have anybody. Then why don't you tell him so, you ridiculous thing, said my mother. Tell him so, retorted Peggotty, looking out of her apron. He never said a word to me about it. He knows better. If he was to make so bold as to say a word to me, I should slap his face. I remarked that my mother, though she smiled when Peggotty looked at her, became more serious and thoughtful. I had seen, at first, that she was changed. Her face was very pretty still, but it looked careworn and too delicate, and her hand was so thin and white that it seemed to me to be almost transparent. But the change to which I now refer was superadded to this. It was in her manner, which became anxious and fluttered. At last she said, putting out her hand and laying it affectionately on the hand of her old servant, Peggotty, dear, are you not going to be married? Me, ma'am, returned Peggotty, staring. Lord bless you, no! Not just yet, said my mother tenderly. Never, cried Peggotty. My mother took her hand and said, Don't leave me, Peggotty. Stay with me. It will not be for long, perhaps. What should I ever do without you? Believe you, my precious, cried Peggotty. Not for all the world and his wife. Why, what's put that in your silly little head? For Peggotty had been used of old to talk to my mother sometimes like a child. We sat round the fire and talked delightfully. I almost believed I had never been away, that Mr. and Miss Murdstone were pictures and would vanish when the fire got low, and that there was nothing real in all that I remembered save my mother, Peggotty, and I. It was almost 10 o'clock before we heard the sound of wheels. We all got up then, and my mother said hurriedly that as it was so late, and Mr. and Mrs. Murdstone approved of early hours for young people, perhaps I had better go to bed. I kissed her and went upstairs with my candle directly before they came in. It appeared to my childish fancy as I ascended to the bedroom, where I had been imprisoned, that they brought a cold blast of air into the house, which blew away the old familiar feeling like a feather. I felt uncomfortable about going down to breakfast in the morning, as I had never set eyes on Mr. Murdstone since the day when I committed my memorable offence. However, as it must be done, I went down after 2 or 3 false starts halfway, and as many runs back on tiptoe to my own room, and presented myself in the parlour. He was standing before the fire with his back to it, while Miss Murdstone made the tea. He looked at me steadily as I entered, but made no sign of recognition whatever. I went up to him after a moment of confusion and said, I beg your pardon, sir. I am very sorry for what I did, and I hope you will forgive me. I am glad to hear you are sorry, David, he replied. The hand he gave me was the hand I had bitten. I could not restrain my eyes from resting for an instant on a red spot upon it, but it was not so red as I turned when I met that sinister expression on his face. How do you do, ma'am? I said to Miss Murdstone. Oh, dear me, sighed Miss Murdstone, giving me the tea-caddy scoop instead of her fingers. How long are the holidays? A month, ma'am. Counting from when? From today, ma'am. Oh, said Miss Murdstone. Then here's one day off. She kept a calendar of the holidays in this way, and every morning checked a day off in exactly the same manner. She did it gloomily until she came to 10. But when she got into two figures, she became more hopeful, and as the time advanced, even jocular. I felt that I made them uncomfortable as they made me. If I came into the room where they were, and they were talking together, and my mother seemed cheerful, an anxious cloud would steal over her face from the moment of my entrance. If Mr. Murdstone were in his best humor, I checked him. If Miss Murdstone were in her worst, I intensified it. Therefore I resolved to keep myself as much out of their way as I could. In the evening sometimes I went and sat with Peggotty in the kitchen. There I was comfortable and not afraid of being myself, but neither of these resources was approved of in the parlour. I was still held to be necessary to my poor mother's training, and as one of her trials could not be suffered to absent myself. David, said Mr. Murdstone one day after dinner, when I was going to leave the room as usual, I am sorry to observe that you are of a sullen disposition. As sulky as a bear, said Miss Murdstone. I stood still and hung my head. Now, David, said Mr. Murdstone, a sullen, obdurate disposition is, of all tempers, the worst. And the boy is, of all dispositions that I have ever seen, remarked his sister, the most confirmed and stubborn. I think, my dear Clara, even you must observe it. I beg your pardon, my dear Jane, said my mother, but are you quite sure? I am certain you'll excuse me, my dear Jane, that you understand Davy. We'll say I don't understand the boy, Clara, returned Miss Murdstone, arranging the little feathers on her wrists. We'll agree, if you please, that I don't understand him at all. He is much too deep for me, but perhaps my brother's penetration may enable him to have some insight into his character, and I believe my brother was speaking on the subject when we, not very decently, interrupted him. I think, Clara, said Mr. Murdstone in a low, grave voice, that there may be better and more dispassionate judges of such a question than you. Edward, replied my mother timidly, you are a far better judge of all questions than I pretend to be. Both you and Jane, You only said something weak and inconsiderate, he replied. Try not to do it again, my dear Clara, and keep a watch upon yourself. My mother's lips moved, as if she answered, Yes, my dear Edward, but she said nothing aloud. I was sorry, David, I remarked, said Mr. Murdstone, turning his head and his eyes stiffly toward me, to observe that you are of a sullen disposition. This is not a character that I can suffer to develop itself beneath my eyes without an effort at improvement. You must endeavour, sir, to change it. We must endeavour to change it for you. I beg your pardon, sir, I faltered. I have never meant to be sullen since I came back. Don't take refuge in a lie, sir, he returned so fiercely that I saw my mother involuntarily put her trembling hand as if to interpose between us. You have withdrawn yourself in your sullenness to your own rooms. I will not have this room shunned as if it were infected at the pleasure of a child. Sit down. He ordered me like a dog, and I obeyed like a dog. One thing more, he said. I observe that you have an attachment to low and common company. You are not to associate with servants. The kitchen will not improve you in the many respects in which you need improvement. Now, David, you understand me, and you know what will be the consequence if you fail to obey me to the letter. I knew well, better perhaps than he thought, as far as my poor mother was concerned, and I obeyed him to the letter. I retreated to my own room no more. I took refuge with Peggotty no more, but sat wearily in the parlour day after day, looking forward to night and bedtime, and we will pause there.